The algorithm has been blessing me lately with all these booktube recommendations for Gothic classics, and I thought, why not join in? And then there's another thing that kind of like inspired me a bit to make this list, which was I read in the introduction to Love by Angela Carter, this book being described as Gothic, or a Gothic book. And I thought, like, what? No, at first I thought no, but then I thought, actually, what is Gothic? Like, in my mind, I suppose what I think about it is the sort of the dark supernatural side of the Romantic movement, and something that happened like around the 100-year period, like from somewhere in the 1700s to the end of the 1800s. But that's quite a long period, right? And like it wasn't consistent. Like there was a big Gothic revival at the end of the 1800s, which gave us things like Dracula, Picture of Dorian Gray, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, you know, all those good things. But at the same time, I imagine at the time they would have been seen as quite different from the original Gothic stories, which were much, you know, older, and I think even like generically quite different. Like my image of like the OG Gothic, of which I've read like nothing basically, maybe nothing at all actually, is like lots of castles and lots of fainting maidens and like, you know, chains and maybe like some dark satanic rituals going on in the background but not talked about directly. And I don't know, actually I should read them really. But yeah, so I thought, who am I to decide what is and what is not Gothic in a historic sense? And if we're just talking about, you know, the Gothic vibes, this dark, decadent, almost like dramatic excess of emotion in a scary scenario, right? Where you often have like almost like a sort of extravagance and like this combination of the emotional and the sinister coming together in what's usually like quite an aesthetic setting. Then there's lots of modern things that could count as Gothic as well. So I thought I would add to the lists floating around out there in this little pre-Halloween moment by giving you some books which aren't usually considered Gothic, or which aren't usually considered like amongst the collection of Dracula and Frankenstein and so on and so forth. And while I'm still not sure if I would categorize Angela Carter's Love as Gothic, then another book by her more famous, The Bloody Chamber, absolutely belongs in that category. I feel like dark feminist retellings of fairy tales is a whole industry now, but I don't think it was when Angela Carter wrote this, I think in the 80s. And you know, she does it best. Angela Carter is an English writer, but she draws from like a lot of the most iconic European folktales. So as with a lot of like folktale, fairy tale retellings, a lot of the fun is in recognizing the story and seeing how it's being twisted. But rather like having some of its original like darkness and potency like drawn out and put on display. This is a short story collection, so you get like all your old favorites, but very twisted and like usually centering female subjectivity. There's vampires, there's werewolves, there's Bluebeard himself in the titular Bloody Chamber. I think my favorite was one of the I think she has two Beauty and the Beast retellings in this book, if I remember right. And one of them is called like The Tiger's Bride or something like that. And there is like a tiger who wears like a human mask, and it's brilliant. It's just fantastic. I think the first line is something like, "My father lost me to the beast at cards." If you're drawn to the macabre, then this belongs on your bookshelf. There was actually one more thing which made me start questioning about like what is Gothic and what is not Gothic, and that led me to come up with this list as well, which is watching another booktuber's video which included Thérèse Raquin by Émile Zola, and I thought this was fascinating to include on a list of Gothic books, and that's why I'm including it myself. So credit to that booktuber, whose name escapes me, but I'll put a link to their video down in the description if you want to check it out. Thérèse Raquin is the story of an affair, a tumultuous love affair, sort of a love triangle, but it's about like basically this woman who has been like kind of stuck with a husband who is very unpleasant and weak, and she is full of fire and unfulfilled. And then a painter, Laurent, I forget the husband's name, but the woman is Thérèse Raquin, and the painter who comes into her life is called Laurent. They begin an affair together. Things get dark. There is a lot of violence and guilt and demons haunting the characters. This novel was written by a young Émile Zola at the end of the 1800s, so right in the middle of that Gothic revival. So in a way it makes sense that it fits there, and it feels like it fits there. But what's interesting is that it's famous for being a work of naturalism, and Zola was famous as a naturalist. And naturalism was seen as like basically the extreme of realism. So at the time there were basically like these two dominating movements in literature, realism and romanticism. Romanticism being like, as you'd expect, expect a lot more emotional, a lot more about like kind of an excess of emotion pouring out onto the page, and it often had like kind of, you know, supernatural elements or knights and princesses or whatever, and it was looking, you know, kind of more at the past. And, you know, romanticizing the past. Whereas realism was like, no, we need to look at what's happening now. We need to look at like the world around us. And naturalism was like the most intense version of that. And so, well, that's weird because it seems like the most intense version of realism should be the opposite of what's one of the most, you know, excessive versions of romanticism, which is Gothic. But it's actually like a circle, I think, because like tonally they're so similar. And I'd love to think and read a bit more about why that might be. But in any case, for now, Thérèse Raquin definitely belongs on this list. There's also a Korean movie called Thirst, which is one of my favorite movies of all time by Park Chan-wook, who adapts a lot of books incredibly well. He also did Fingersmith, I think it was, by Sarah Waters, right? But anyway, yeah, he adapts Thérèse Raquin. I've never seen anyone officially say that he adapted Thérèse Raquin, but if you watch the movie and you read the book, you know, right? And the reason I bring this up is not only because it's an amazing movie and everyone should watch it, but because he adds vampires. He just sticks in vampires. So he obviously saw the Gothic potential of Thérèse Raquin. But in my opinion, the vampires actually improve the story. So maybe I got to read it again, but I recommend everybody watch the movie, read the book, and tell me what you think. Next we have Bestiary, another short story collection, this time by the Argentinian master Julio Cortázar. He translated, I think he began his career translating Edgar Allan Poe into Spanish. And you can see the influence that Poe has had on him. But at the same time, this is not just like the Argentinian version or something like that. I wouldn't say like he's Argentina's Poe or something. He is his own thing. His stories are usually set in his present day, which I think was around the 60s. And there is just something more abstract, conceptual, like kind of philosophical as well, in the way that like the sinister thing happens in these stories. For example, we have a motorcyclist who's in an accident in Paris, I think, and then while unconscious has a dream he's being chased in the jungles by Aztecs, and then wakes up in the hospital, but then falls asleep and has the dream again, and the dream continues, right? I think it was Descartes who said that the way that we know that this is reality and the dreams are dreams is because reality has continuation. Like every time you wake up, you're in the same place as when you went to sleep, whereas the dreams are all like fragmented and not linked properly. I mean, like that whole thing, it seems like the conceit of this story, because like there's continuation both in the dreams and in the motorcycle accident kind of world. So it starts to feel like what is actually happening. Is he maybe an indigenous person who's being hunted by the Aztecs, hundreds of years ago? Are both of those stories like equally legitimate? Like, is there a hierarchy of reality over dream when both of them are actually just fiction? Another one is about a guy obsessed with axolotls, and every day he goes to the aquarium and just stares at the axolotls for ages until something happens. And I won't say what, but this is like a 2-page short story, and it's amazing. There's a brother and a sister who live in a house, but something else is living in the house with them and slowly forcing them out of the house, slowly taking over room by room and making the space that they live in smaller and smaller. There's another one with a house with a tiger in it, right? And the way the family manages that, I think it's quite a big house, right? They just avoid the tiger, basically. And if it's in the kitchen, they just close the door, and then they eat in the garden that day, and they just live their lives while coexisting with the tiger and making sure they don't ever occupy the same space as it. So there's a lot of these fantastical situations which might, not for all of them, immediately sound horrific, but there is like a sense often of dread, and there's often like a kind of a turn or a twist in the story which makes things go in a very dark way. Tale of a Castle Keep by Izumi Kyoka is a play that I read recently, and it's about this, it's set in the feudal period in Japan. It's in a castle, and in the keep of the castle, which is like the central tallest tower on the highest levels, is occupied by spirits and a princess who is also like some sort of spirit creature, maybe a demon, I'm not sure. There is something kind of very strange and sinister about them. And meanwhile, the human men and warlords live on the lower levels of the castle. This actually sounds a bit like the tiger story in a way, but it's told in a totally different way. It's got a much more fairy tale-ish kind of feel to it. And essentially the story is told from the point of view of the magical creatures. And it took a while for me to realize even that humans were in this story. The plot is not the main thing here. It's more the way that Kyoka manages to evoke this quite strange, folkloric, aristocratic old Japanese world, which is also magic and sinister, right? Like you feel anything could happen. Blood could start dripping down the walls and the characters would lick it up and then go have tea and cakes. I imagine this one is quite difficult to find actually, but if you do get a chance to get your hands on it, then I strongly recommend it. Next up we have a witch story. It's V by Gogol, the Ukrainian writer who went to Russia and often took like a lot of the folkloric inspiration from Ukraine, which was like part of Russia at the time, right? And then turned that into more, I wouldn't say modernist because that wasn't a thing yet, but like kind of psychological realist kind of stories. But yeah, it's a story about a witch, right? It's about a young student who has an encounter with a witch, and it leads to quite a harrowing sequence where he has to stay with a dead body in a church for 3 nights, and we go through each of the nights. Gogol is one of my all-time favorite writers, but this was a story that I didn't quite love as much as I love most of his work, so I really want to revisit it because I feel like I should love it given that it's so gothic. So I do want to revisit it, and it was very good. It's just that I have an extremely high standard for Gogol. Another all-time favorite is Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo, a Mexican writer. I talk about this book a lot on this channel. It's a ghost town in Mexico called Comala. It's very hot there. There's basically only dead people. A guy called Juan Preciado comes to town looking for his father, who he's never met before, who's called Pedro Páramo because he believes that man owes him something. And he finds out that the town is not a great place to be, actually. Through the people and voices that he encounters, we slowly start to get a sense of what the history was, who lived here, and who is Pedro Páramo, and what did he do to Comala, because we know he is not a good person. Leaping back to Russia for The Double by Dostoevsky, this is like, as far as I know, the definitive like doppelganger book. Maybe E.T.A. Hoffman actually has something like this, but I don't know. Anyway, of what I've read, if you want to read a doppelganger book, this is the one to read. It's about a minor office clerk called Golyadkin, who is kind of weird, kind of a bit of an outcast, and like unhappy and unsatisfied with his position in his company, and like he's into, I think, the boss's daughter or something like that, and like she's doesn't know that he exists, right? So he's not very satisfied with his life, and then a person appears and gets a job at his company, and that person looks exactly the same as him, exactly the same, and has the same name as him. And no one, apart from Golyadkin, really thinks much of this, maybe because Golyadkin was like such a non-entity for the circles that he moved in to begin with, that like when another version of him appears who's just a bit more likable, then people notice that person and he starts becoming popular. But the actual original, our narrator guy, just continues to be trod underfoot. There's another good movie adaptation of this made by Richard Ayoade and starring, what's his name? I want to say Michael Cera, but it's absolutely not Michael Cera. Jesse Eisenberg, who's very good at doing like the two Golyadkins. I think like every actor wants that, don't they? They want to play a movie where they get to play two parts and show how they can be two different people, like a chameleon. But yeah, anyway, I recommend both the book and the movie. Now, I mentioned E.T.A. Hoffman, but I've not read anything by E.T.A. Hoffman. But I do have a favorite German writer who I think fits on this list, and that's Heinrich von Kleist. A lot of his stories are about the limits of rationalism. Usually bad things happen, and then the limits of our social order and our reasoning and everything, like they're all met, and then they cannot cope with the bad thing happening. The bad thing is sometimes rape, it's sometimes like an earthquake, there's a revolution. He talks about different moments in history as well, which is quite interesting. The stories that maybe fit this most are The Foundling, about it's kind of like the changeling myth where one child is replaced with a fairy. In this case, there's no supernatural element apparently, although it kind of teeters on that. But yeah, like one child dies and is replaced with another child, and then bad things start to happen. And also the story Saint Cecilia, or The Power of Music, that's the full title. That is set at a time when there's a lot of Protestant rioting on the continent, and they are like, a lot of Protestants are like going to Catholic churches and burning them down, and this one such church is threatened. Then something strange happens, which seems like a miracle, seems like divine intervention to stop the riot. But that thing in itself takes on dark kind of has a dark side to it, which we learn about very, very quickly. I won't go into the details, but I do think it's one of the best short stories ever written. And that and The Foundling can both be found in the Penguin edition called The Marquise of O and Other Stories. Let's have another play. Let's do Macbeth by William Shakespeare. This is like quite different from the other ones I've mentioned so far, because everything I've said has come after the books which are usually like considered the ones that created this genre called Gothic, whereas this one is before, written like in the 1500s, right? Early 1500s. But yeah, you know, witches, lightning, murder, intrigue, despair, guilt, paranoia, ghosts, right? It's like, it absolutely fits the Gothic genre, even though it predates it. The story, for those who don't know, is about a Scottish nobleman, Macbeth, who encounters some witches with his friend Banquo, and they foresee him becoming the king of Scotland. And once he has this idea, and once he discusses it with his very ambitious wife, Lady Macbeth, they start to form a plan to make this prophecy become reality. Sticking with Ye Olde England, I want to add Paradise Lost by John Milton onto this list. This is a massive poem, an epic poem, and it definitely belongs here for the first part, at least. The first part is the best part, right? It's retelling Genesis from the Bible, and it's retelling how Satan is thrown out of heaven for rebelling against God. And we begin with Satan cast into hell and just kind of, you know, making sense of what's happened, being in hell and being really awesome about it, to be honest. His defiance, his strength of character, his passion, and his unwillingness to give up, you know, like, and his, even at the absolute lowest possible place you could be amongst the fire and devastation, he wants to make this dark and twisted place his own heaven, right? His own version of heaven, because that is the best that he can do at that point. And it's just like an inspiring story of the underdog Lord of Evil. And I challenge anybody to read those things and not find themselves rooting for Satan. The short stories of Akutagawa Ryunosuke are amazing. You should read anything you can get your hands on. He has never written a bad short story, you know, like there's always the, oh, but I like this one, but I didn't like that one so much. Everything is gold. This man is an incredible writer. He's also famous on rewriting Japanese folk tales, but from a modernist perspective, and adding in that kind of psychological and symbolic element is often what makes them more gothic in a way, because like as has become clear from this video, I think a lot of folk tales and fairy tales have this kind of you know, dark sensibility built into them, and then it takes later writers of generations who are more interested in the psychological side of things, like Angela Carter or Gogol, or in this case Akutagawa, to draw out that darkness and make it more about human emotion rather than just the story that happens. And I think that Akutagawa's most famous stories, like the ones that are actually taught in Japanese schools, are probably the most gothic ones as well. I'm thinking of The Spider's Web, which is about a criminal who Buddha takes mercy on because he once saved a spider in life, and so Buddha from heaven like lowers a spider's thread down into hell for that person to climb out of hell. Then there is Rashōmon. Rashōmon is the name of a gate, a Japanese gate, where it's like the kind of gate that is like kind of a medieval fortification, like you can go inside it, and it's extremely dark and quite horrible, and like it's such a short story. I think it's just like 2 or 3 pages, so there's no point really going into the plot of what happens, but yeah, it's grim. In a Bamboo Grove, I think it's called, which is the story that the filmmaker Kurosawa used for his movie of Rashōmon, because Rashōmon is, like I said, just like 3 pages or something. So he used like kind of those 3 pages, but then he, like as a framing device for the story, which is called In a Bamboo Grove. Basically, a man and his wife are traveling, and then a bandit appears, and the end result is that the man who is traveling is killed. But then what actually happened in the confrontation needs to be understood, and like it's testified by the different characters, including the ghost of the man who is summoned in a kind of funny way to explain what he understood as the crime. And the point is that everybody has their own different story, and they're all stacked against each other, and it's like the layering of different versions of the same event creates not just uncertainty, but more a sense of like, what are people anyways? Like, why do we interpret things the way we do? And like, I think this story is often seen as just well, you can never know the truth because everything is subjective, which I think is actually you know, quite a reductive way to look at it. I think the story is much more than that, which is why it's still a very compelling read to this day. But of all the freaky Akutagawa stories, then there is one which takes the biscuit, and that is Hellscreen. Hellscreen is about a painter in a Japanese court, and he is quite dislikable, I think, and you know, just a kind of grouchy, not nice guy. But things happen with his daughter and the Lord and that he works for, and it gets into a very dark place, like really horrifying stuff. I gave this one to my dad to read, and he gave it back to me and was like, yeah, that was horrible. And that was like all he had to say about it, which is fair enough. You might have that reaction as well. And finally, I want to mention the Southern Gothic. I haven't read any Southern Gothic novels, I think. But I have read some Tennessee Williams, including A Streetcar Named Desire. So that play, I think, is one of the most like representative Southern Gothic works. It's when you take like the kind of the dark romanticism of the Gothic genre and you connect it to the American South with its like kind of fading culture, the lingering traumas of the Civil War, and you know, maybe certain kind of resentments at what was lost, including especially I think in the work of Tennessee Williams, this idea of a decaying aristocracy which doesn't have any place in modern America persisting, or at least in people's imaginations and in their psyches persisting, even if not in their actual material wealth. That is certainly the case for Blanche Dubois in Streetcar Named Desire, who moves in with her sister Stella and Stella's husband Stanley, and there's this festering tension which begins to build between especially Stanley and Blanche. And while there's no ghosts and goblins or castles and witches or anything supernatural going on here, there's a reason why it's called the Southern Gothic. As a character study and as like this exploration of desire and like kind of defining yourself against other people, what they have and what you want. There's such a dense and heady claustrophobic atmosphere, and like that plus Blanche being just one of the most iconic characters in all of fiction, makes sense that this has had a big impact on American popular culture and why it, you know, reappears in cinema quite a lot as well. And a very good episode of The Simpsons too. So there you go. That's my list of alternative Gothic classics. Let me know what you thought of it or what you would add to it. I'd be very interested to hear down in the comments below. Catch you next time.